Alrighty, so here's the deal. This video was a little bit of a rabbit hole that I took myself down, and you are going to come with me. Now, is Dungeons & Dragons really medieval? No, it's fantasy. And I could leave it at that, but I have a much more detailed explanation. So the first thing I want to do is define what fantasy is, and then define a medieval world as we know it historically. And at the end of this video, I'll talk about what that means for your D&D game from a world-building perspective. So what is fantasy? It's dragons, fairies, magic, castles, princesses, all that kind of stuff. Those are some of the things that people expect when they hear fantasy. In any type of storytelling, there is a difference between genre and setting. And to use a separate genre as an example, there's a difference between a cowboy story and a story set in the American West. People expect specific elements from a cowboy story, like the stand up at high noon, all the gunfights, the buffalo stampede, and those things are not inherently present in a story set in the 1800s of Colorado. Likewise, fantasy has its own tropes and expectations that we expect when we hear that word. And therefore, fantasy can have any setting as long as the core assumptions of fantasy are present. Now, standard Dungeons & Dragons is decidedly not a modern fantasy setting, like Harry Potter or something, and it isn't antiquated either. It doesn't take place in ancient times, most of the time. And the term medieval fantasy evokes a very specific image in our heads that we can all agree upon. That's knights and castles, wizards and towers, kings and kingdoms, and it's a subgenre of fantasy which, by definition, is medieval. But would a medieval society exposed to magic and supernatural things truly be medieval as we know it? To dive deeper, we need to take a look at the core assumptions of a standard Dungeons & Dragons world. Those assumptions are that gods oversee the world, much of the world is untamed, the world is ancient, conflict shapes the world's history, and the world is magical. And magic is the X factor. Primarily because I believe magic is what separates fantasy from reality in the first place. But also because not all magical worlds are created equal. Eberron, for example, makes the use of magic an everyday occurrence, as magical flying ships and trains carry travelers from one great city to another. So that world can probably be defined as something a little more advanced than medieval, but maybe not quite. Another good example to look at is the world of Avatar: The Last Airbender. We have firebenders shooting fire out of tanks next to soldiers who are carrying medieval weapons, and they all wear medieval armor. And that juxtaposition suggests a bit of a time period that's shifting from a more medieval setting to a more modernized setting. And that's just based on the audience's collective understanding of what medieval versus modern looks like. Does magic remove or make irrelevant the key factors that make a world medieval? Historically, medieval literally means of the Middle Ages. In the case of our world, middle refers to the time period between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. The Middle Ages are also known as the Dark Ages, and this is due to the presumed lack of cultural and scientific advancement of the Western world for about 1,000 years. Prior to that, superstitious beliefs dominated how most common folk viewed the world and their understanding of it. Only fresh perspectives and scientific breakthroughs that came through during the Renaissance changed how people perceived the world. The Renaissance, and every age since, and maybe a little bit before that, did provide some scientific, rational explanations for what causes natural phenomena. Volcanoes are not the result of fire-breathing dragons or primordial blacksmithing deities, but a natural occurrence brought about by the workings of physics, chemistry, and geology. The very stories and mythologies that inspired Dungeons & Dragons in the first place served humanity for millennia as a means of entertainment, passing down generational knowledge, and of course warning of the dangers of the natural world. Very real things are behind some of the most outlandish folklore out there. And even more recently, some of the most well-beloved and well-known fairy tales, such as Red Riding Hood, are metaphors for the dangers of the woods, because the untamed wilderness can be deadly, even today. For the sake of argument, you could define a medieval world as one that is woefully ignorant about how the natural world truly operates, with little to no cultural and scientific advancement to speak of for hundreds of years. So how is that then different from a fantasy world? I think the difference is that in a fantasy world, things like plagues, natural disasters, other horrible things really do have supernatural explanations behind them. Suddenly, when a superstition is real, the people who hold such beliefs are no longer ignorant medieval peasants, but well-informed, rational, and wise individuals who are surprisingly self-aware of themselves and how the world works around them, especially when compared to medieval commoners of our world. Furthermore, in a world like Faerun, magic essentially replaces science. The most notable scholars and adventurers of the world are wizards and artificers. They're students of the arcane. And yes, artificers are more techy, but they still infuse their creations with magic. And it's to be assumed that entire orders of wizards spend their lives studying magic, and that will regularly advance the understanding of magic and develop magical breakthroughs that hopefully benefits the quality of life for everyone, or just creates owlbears. Now, whether or not the wizards of your world share that knowledge with others is completely up to you, and I think the answer to that question could determine if that aspect of your world is medieval or not. Now, from a cultural standpoint, we need to look no further than the languages in Dungeons & Dragons. Now, I want to caveat this with the fact that language as a mechanic is simply there to make the lives of the players easier. However, there are a slew of languages, including Common, which almost every sentient creature in any world can understand and usually speak. Player characters learn the languages from two places. One is their racial features, and the second is their background. Most races allow their character to learn two languages, usually their ethnic language and Common. And while adventurers are a step above your average commoner in a D&D world, languages are in the setup phase of your character, and because it has to do with before they were an adventurer, it alludes to the fact that most people are bilingual, and that includes everybody in the world. It can be assumed to some degree that there is regular interaction between ethnic groups in Dungeons & Dragons, enough that anyone who sets out into the world, adventurers, hunters, sailors, and even merchants, take the time to learn multiple languages. And if there are regular interactions, there's a regular mixture of cultures as a whole. And sometimes these cultural differences come together to form something new. And that is the very definition of cultural evolution. And that kind of world sounds a lot like the one we live in now. Again, it's a little bit of a rabbit hole, but it makes sense. Now, there is one core assumption in the Dungeon Master's Guide that could subvert this entire argument, and that is that much of the world is untamed. How can there be cultural and magical innovation if groups of people living in their own kingdoms and villages are isolated from each other? And I'm talking between leagues of wilderness filled with monsters and magical phenomena. I think conventionally it would be very hard, but then there are the adventurers. Bottom line, the world of Dungeons & Dragons are put together in such a way that they create a fun experience for the player character. Now, those player characters can hail from any number of backgrounds with any number of different kinds of experiences. There are just as many different kinds of adventurers as there are people actually playing Dungeons & Dragons. And I think usually it's the assumption that the group of adventurers that make up your party are the only adventurers in the world. And so it can be reasonable to assume that the only outside interaction an isolated kingdom has is from these adventurers. And I run games like that sometimes too. I mean, the players as a group are the center of the story, after all. But everyone still conveniently speaks and understands Common wherever they go. And I take that as evidence that there is no cultural stagnation within a standard Dungeons & Dragons world. And so we come back to the answer. Dungeons & Dragons is a fantasy world, not a inherently medieval world. However, I think it could be. On the same page of a Dungeon Master's Guide that lays out all of these core assumptions, it also says, the assumptions sketched out above aren't carved in stone. Ask yourself, what if the standard assumptions of my world were not true? So what does all this mean for your Dungeons & Dragons world that you are homebrewing? Firstly, it means that by default, you're running a fantasy world. Plain and simple. You're not constrained to any given time period, and that is the magic of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. You can reskin weapons and equipment to reflavor your world as a modern one. And it's really easy. What you could do is call a shortbow a 9mm and call arrows bullets. And suddenly, you're in a modern world running around in cars and, chasing after a dragon made of concrete or whatever. And it is still a fantasy game set in a fantasy world. Most importantly, it's still D&D 5e. I know there are tons of systems out there, more than I'm even aware of, and some are designed for a modern setting. And if you want to try those, go play them, because they sound like a lot of fun. I'm starting to get into a few different ones myself. But with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, you don't have to learn a new system if you don't want to, and you want to play something that feels a little bit different than your run-of-the-mill adventure. Because flavoring stuff is just a lot of fun. Now, what if you did want your world to feel authentically like a medieval world? And I think the answer to that is dark fantasy. I mean, we don't call medieval times the Dark Ages for nothing. So a dark fantasy world can have core assumptions that are inherently different from the ones laid out in the Dungeon Master's Guide. For example, the gods may be dead, or magic and the knowledge it brings could be jealously guarded by those who practice it. Magic could also simply be less common, and therefore wizards and sorcerers who use it are feared among the common folk. The cost to learn or practice magic could be dire, such as spells that use hit points instead of spell slots when they are cast. While conflict shapes the world's history in a standard D&D game, conflict shapes the current events of a dark fantasy world. And yeah, conflict is the core of any adventure-type game, but in medieval times, cultures were just as likely to clash violently as they were peacefully. And that's not even taking into account the very real and ever-present supernatural dangers that come from the monsters that inhabit this fantasy world. Other core assumptions are played up to the extreme. For example, dark fantasy leans into the assumption that the world is untamed, even to the point where the world is unknowable. The greatest human fear is fear of the unknown, and the best horror stories feed on that very fear. So play with the isolation factor of the small kingdoms and settlements that dot the landscape of your world, maybe even going as far as to tie languages down to specific geographical areas. Player characters may only learn their ethnic languages and maybe one additional language from their background, and most importantly, common does not exist at all. This will ensure that cultural borders exist, and it will feed into the distrust commoners will have for strangers wandering into their village, which establishes an atmosphere of uncertainty. Now, at the end of the day, it's your world, so do what you want to do. And if you want it to be medieval, I genuinely think dark fantasy is the way to go.